I heard the exact moment my marriage ended. It was between a bite of toast and a sip of coffee. You're not even worth it anymore. I can't believe I've spent 15 years on someone so medium. He said it casually. Not loud, not angry, just bored. I didn't flinch. I buttered my toast, I chewed, I swallowed, and while he kept talking, explaining my mediocrity to me as if it were a business report, I quietly began planning the kind of exit that doesn't make noise. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 15 years I had been the silent architecture of my husband's success. Daniel liked to describe himself as self-made. I never corrected him. He believed he built his consulting firm alone. He believed he networked alone, strategized alone, carried stress alone. He believed his rise had something to do with brilliance and timing and masculine instinct. He did not notice that I managed every dinner party, every holiday card, every investor spouse, every social detail that made him look stable and enviable. He did not notice that I edited his presentations at midnight, that I ghost wrote 3 keynote speeches, that I caught accounting discrepancies before the auditors did. He did not notice because I never required applause. That was my first mistake. When he said medium, he meant invisible. He leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone as if he had just commented on the weather. I just expected more by now, he continued. Other women reinvent themselves, they evolve. You're still this. This. I folded my napkin. I see, I said calmly. He looked almost disappointed that I wasn't reacting. You don't even care? He pressed. Oh, I replied, meeting his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. I care. And that was the last honest thing I said to him. Daniel thrived on reaction. Anger fed him. Tears validated him. Silence confused him. So I chose silence. Over the next week, I became observant. Daniel's routines were precise. Gym at 6, office by 8. Lunch at the same restaurant 3 times a week. Thursday strategy sessions that ran late. His phone had recently gained a privacy screen. His passwords had changed. I did not ask questions. Instead, I made appointments. Not for therapy, not for confrontation, for documentation. I called our financial advisor, requesting a portfolio review. I called our attorney under the pretense of estate planning updates. I scheduled a meeting with our accountant. I smiled at everyone. Daniel assumed I was planning something decorative, a renovation, a charity event, a new hobby to compensate for my medium life. He had no idea I was conducting an audit of everything. And I mean everything. You need to understand something about Daniel. He believed control was love. He managed our finances for efficiency. He insisted on joint accounts for transparency. He structured our investments for tax advantages. What he did not realize, because he had underestimated me for over a decade, was that I had never stopped reading the statements. I knew the asset structure. I knew which properties were in LLCs. I knew which trusts existed and which ones did not. And I knew something else. 3 years ago, when Daniel restructured the firm to bring in outside partners, he transferred a significant percentage of shares into a holding entity, an entity registered in my name. For liability protection, he had said. He forgot that paperwork cuts both ways. 2 Thursdays after the breakfast comment, I followed him. Not dramatically, discreetly. He met her at a hotel bar 20 minutes from his office. She was younger, sharp haircut, efficient posture. The kind of woman who studies men like Daniel for leverage. I did not feel jealous. I felt analytical. He was leaning forward, eager, animated, performative. He had not leaned toward me like that in years. When they stood to leave together, I took a photo. Not for emotional reasons. For sequencing. Evidence is not collected out of anger. It is collected out of foresight. That evening, he came home late, smelling faintly of expensive perfume layered over hotel soap. You're still up? He asked, surprised. I was reading, I said. He poured himself a drink. Big things coming, he announced vaguely. Yes, I replied. I imagine there are. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to detect something. I gave him nothing. The next morning, I visited our attorney. I did not cry. I did not dramatize. I simply asked for copies of everything: corporate structures, property deeds, trust documents, insurance policies. He hesitated once. Is there a concern? He asked carefully. Yes, I said, there is. And then I outlined, calmly and precisely, how I wanted to restructure my protection. He listened differently after that. Here's what Daniel forgot. For 15 years, I signed documents he barely read. I handled filings. I attended closings when he was too busy. My signature exists in places he does not remember, including on the operating agreement that governs the holding entity containing 30% of his firm. 30%. Not symbolic, controlling. He had insisted on my involvement once, long ago, to simplify spousal ownership issues. He never revoked it. He never imagined he would need to. By the end of the month, I had opened an individual account in a separate institution, redirected my consulting income, the small, quiet stream he ignored, into that account, copied every relevant financial record, confirmed the exact language in the operating agreement regarding dissolution rights, and then I waited, because exits are not impulsive, they are timed. Daniel made his mistake 3 weeks later. He came home energized. I've been thinking, he said, loosening his tie. Maybe we should talk about restructuring things. In what sense? I asked. Our arrangement, assets, expectations. I don't want complications if we decide to separate. If we decide, he had already decided. He just wanted the upper hand. What do you propose? I asked gently. He outlined it confidently. A buyout, a modest settlement, a narrative of amicable transition. He had prepared numbers. They were insulting, deliberately. He believed I would panic. He believed I would negotiate from fear. Instead, I nodded slowly. I'll review it, I said. That night, while he slept, I reread the operating agreement. Section 8.4, dissolution by majority interest. 30% under certain conditions could block restructuring or force valuation review. He did not have unilateral authority. Not without me. The following Monday, I made 3 calls. One to our attorney, one to a forensic accountant, and one to a private investigator. Not to confirm the affair, to map its financial intersections. Because if Daniel was moving assets, and men like Daniel always move assets before they move wives, I wanted timestamps. And if company funds were subsidizing hotel rooms, dinners, or gifts, then this was no longer personal. It was corporate misconduct. At dinner that week, he tried again. I think we both know this chapter is closing, he said, performing gravity. I agree, I replied calmly. His confidence sharpened. Then let's be adults about it. Oh, I said, taking a measured sip of wine. I intend to be. He mistook composure for surrender. That was his final miscalculation. You see, Daniel believed he was divorcing a medium woman. What he was actually doing was triggering a structural review of his entire empire. And I had built enough of it to know exactly where the load-bearing walls were. He thought I would leave quietly. He forgot that I know how everything is held together. And I was about to test what happens when support is removed, deliberately, precisely, and without raising my voice. Daniel filed first. He did it theatrically, served papers at noon at my Pilates studio as if spectacle translated to dominance. I accepted them with a steady hand. See you in court, he said later that evening, leaning in the doorway like a man who believed he'd already won. You will, I replied. The next 48 hours were quiet on the surface. Underneath, everything shifted. My attorney filed a motion to freeze any unilateral transfer of corporate shares pending review. We triggered a valuation audit under Section 8.4 of the operating agreement, the clause Daniel had forgotten. 30% doesn't sound like power until it blocks liquidity. His investors were notified, not dramatically, formally. There is nothing more unsettling to men like Daniel than formal documentation. The forensic accountant delivered the first report 3 days later. Company funds had covered 2 strategy retreats at the same boutique hotel, repeated restaurant charges on evenings logged as client meetings, a jewelry purchase routed through a marketing expense line, The jeweler confirmed delivery to her office address. I did not feel rage. I felt precision tightening. Daniel called that night. "You're overreacting," he said, his tone edged with irritation. "You're making this ugly." "I didn't initiate the audit," I replied evenly. "The operating agreement did." A pause. "You're going to hurt the firm." "No," I said. "I'm protecting my interest in it." He exhaled sharply. "This isn't who you are." That almost made me smile. "You're right," I said. "It isn't who I was." 2 days later, his lead investor requested a private meeting. They were concerned about reputational exposure. Affairs are inconvenient. Financial misconduct is disqualifying. Daniel's leverage began to thin. He texted me at midnight. "What do you want?" I waited until morning to answer. Compliance, transparency, and a revised settlement reflecting actual value. No emotion, no threat, just terms. The private investigator sent the final file the following week. Photos, dates, hotel check-ins overlapping with board meetings. One image in particular, Daniel entering the hotel suite at noon, leaving at 4, then logging into a virtual client conference from the lobby. Time-stamped, correlated, irrefutable. I forwarded the report to my attorney. Then I poured myself tea. Daniel arrived home early that Friday. His confidence was gone. "You're trying to ruin me," he said. "No," I answered calmly. "I'm refusing to be erased." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him use in negotiations. "This can still be simple." "It could have been," I agreed, "before you decided I was expendable." He stared at me then, really stared, as if seeing an unfamiliar structure where he once assumed open space. "What happened to you?" he asked. I stopped mistaking silence for loyalty. The revised settlement arrived 3 days later, substantially different. Equitable division, full valuation, retention of my corporate stake or buyout at market rate, reimbursement of misused funds. He signed it without commentary. This time he read every line. The day I moved out, there was no drama. I packed deliberately, personal items only. I left the house immaculate. On the kitchen counter, I placed a single envelope. Inside, a copy of the original operating agreement. Section 8.4 highlighted. Nothing else. No note. No explanation. Men like Daniel do not learn from speeches. They learn from consequences. A week later, I heard through one of the investors that Daniel had stepped down temporarily, pending internal review. Temporarily is a word corporations use before permanent decisions. His affair dissolved shortly after. Apparently, crisis is less attractive than ambition. The morning my buyout funds cleared, I stood in my new apartment overlooking the river. Quiet, unfurnished, mine. I made coffee. I sat by the window, and I replayed that breakfast conversation in my mind. Medium. It's remarkable how careless words can detonate foundations. Daniel thought he was diminishing me. What he actually did was remove the final illusion I was protecting. He didn't destroy my life. He triggered its restructuring, and this time, I am the sole architect. Success is quiet. Recovery is quieter. But reinvention, that requires visibility. 2 months after the settlement finalized, Daniel's firm announced a strategic leadership transition. That was the polite version. The impolite version was simpler. Investors do not tolerate instability tied to ego. And Daniel had made everything personal. I did not contact him. I did not check on him. I did not ask mutual friends for updates. Information still reached me. It always does. The woman from the hotel bar had resigned. Her LinkedIn quietly updated to seeking new opportunities. Daniel's name disappeared from keynote panels he had once headlined. Reputation erodes faster than marriage when misconduct enters the room. Meanwhile, I built. Not emotionally, structurally. My buyout provided liquidity. Liquidity provides leverage. Instead of retreating into something decorative or symbolic, I did something Daniel would never have predicted. I acquired a minority stake in one of his competitor firms. Not vindictively, strategically. The industry is small, boards overlap, narratives travel. I did not speak about Daniel publicly. I didn't need to. Professional circles understand patterns without instruction. 3 weeks into my new investment, I was invited to a private strategy session. Different energy. No performance, no ego driven monologues, just measured discussion and accountability. When I offered insight, actual operational insight, no one looked surprised. No one looked amused. They listened. That alone felt revolutionary. One evening, I received an email from Daniel. Subject line, "Can we talk?" I let it sit for 12 hours before opening it. The message was concise. "I underestimated you. I was wrong. I'm dealing with fallout I didn't anticipate. I'd like to handle things more cooperatively." Cooperative. The word men use when consequences arrive. I did not reply. Instead, I forwarded the email to my attorney. Documentation is a habit now. A week later, I saw him for the first time since the settlement. A charity gala. I attended as a board member. He attended as a guest. That distinction mattered. He looked older, not physically or structurally. Confidence replaced by calculation. He approached me carefully. "You look well," he said. "I am," I replied. A pause. "I never meant for it to go this way." "That's the problem," I said evenly. "You never meant anything carefully." He swallowed. "I thought you'd fight differently." "I did fight differently," I said. "I just chose architecture over argument." He studied me, searching for softness. "You could have ruined me," he said quietly. "I didn't need to," I answered. "You handled that portion yourself." Silence settled between us. For the first time in 15 years, I felt no gravitational pull toward his approval. No reflex to soothe, no instinct to manage his discomfort. Freedom is not loud, it's the absence of obligation. As the evening ended, I stepped onto the terrace overlooking the city lights. A young associate from the competitor firm joined me. "I've heard impressive things about you," she said. "From whom?" I asked. She smiled. "From people who pay attention." I returned the smile. For years, Daniel had convinced me visibility was vanity. He was wrong. Visibility is accountability. Visibility is ownership. Visibility is leverage. When I returned home that night, I opened my laptop and drafted something I'd postponed for too long. My own firm. Not a shadow role, not advisory, not background architecture, leadership. I mapped the structure carefully. Partnership agreements that could not be weaponized. Equity splits that required transparency. Exit clauses that protected contribution. If you build something once, you learn where it fractures. If you rebuild it, you design differently. 3 months later, the firm launched. Small, deliberate, efficient. Clients followed. Reputation compounds when it is not diluted by someone else's insecurity. The final interaction with Daniel came unexpectedly. A certified letter. He was selling the house. Not our house. His temporary apartment. Liquidity pressures, apparently. The market had not been as forgiving as he assumed. Enclosed was a brief handwritten note. "You weren't medium. I just didn't want you to see how much you carried." No apology, just recognition. I folded the note once. Then I placed it in a file labeled completed. Because that's what he is. Completed. If you're waiting for me to say I destroyed everything he thought he had, I didn't. I removed my support from it. Structures collapse when the load-bearing element withdraws. Daniel believed I was decorative. He never realized I was foundational. And when the foundation steps away, the building reveals what it really is. Temporary. And this time, I built something that does not require me to shrink inside it. Power does not disappear when a marriage ends. It redistributes. And I was finally done donating mine. 6 months after the divorce, my firm was stable. Not flashy, not inflated, just disciplined. We specialized in structural advisory, corporate governance, asset protection, operational resilience. In other words, we fixed the exact kind of blind spots that had nearly cost me everything. Investors appreciate experience. They appreciate even more when that experience was earned the hard way. Daniel resurfaced professionally before he did personally. A former colleague of his requested a consultation. We're restructuring after some internal turbulence, she said carefully. I recognize the language. Turbulence is what people call ego-driven collapse when lawyers are present. I took the meeting, not because of Daniel, because I do not refuse opportunity out of sentiment. The firm was bleeding. 3 senior clients had withdrawn. 2 junior partners were negotiating exits, and the board wanted governance reform. I outlined exactly what needed to happen: clear financial oversight, independent auditing authority, revised leadership accountability clauses. They listened. One board member finally asked, "How do you know where these fractures start?" I held his gaze. Because I once supported a structure that hid them. Silence followed. Respectful silence. 2 weeks later, I was retained, officially, to redesign the internal operating framework of the firm Daniel had built. I did not ask if he approved. He no longer had unilateral approval. That, too, had shifted. The first board session was tense. Daniel was present, not leading, present. That distinction again. He did not look at me when I entered the room. I did not look for him. I began immediately. Current governance fails to prevent financial opacity, I said evenly. There are no automatic triggers for compliance review when personal expenditures intersect corporate accounts. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's jaw tightened. This isn't about history, he said carefully. It's about moving forward. It is about pattern prevention, I corrected. History is relevant because it identifies pattern. The room understood the subtext. Daniel remained quiet after that. Over the next month, the restructuring was implemented. Audit triggers activated automatically. Expense reporting required cross-verification. Leadership compensation was tied to measurable ethical benchmarks. Personal misconduct with corporate financial implications would result in immediate suspension pending review. Daniel signed the revised framework. Because he had to, because capital demands compliance. The night the reforms went public, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. You've positioned yourself well. No bitterness, just recognition. I responded once. I positioned myself accurately. He didn't reply. There's something deeply clarifying about sitting across from someone who once diminished you and watching them operate inside systems you designed. Not vindictive, not emotional, just factual. He moved differently now, measured, contained. The performance was gone. And for the first time, I saw the fragility behind the ego. 3 months later, a media outlet reached out. They were profiling women in corporate governance reform. My name had surfaced. I agreed to the interview on one condition: no personal drama narrative. No divorced wife rises from ashes. Just structure, just leadership. The headline read, Architecting Accountability, Evelyn Carter on Structural Power in Modern Firms. Daniel texted that night. Congratulations. I read it. I did not answer. Closure does not require conversation. Then came the final shift. An acquisition offer. Not for my firm, for Daniel's. A larger entity wanted control. And under the new governance framework, the one I had written, minority equity holders had approval rights. I was one of them. 30% had been converted into advisory equity when I negotiated the buyout. He had accepted that clause to avoid extended litigation. He likely assumed it would remain symbolic. It wasn't. The acquisition terms undervalued long-term performance projections. I flagged it immediately. This is a short-term exit disguised as growth, I told the board. The long-term dilution risk is severe. Daniel argued for the deal. Liquidity pressure again, history repeating. But this time, votes mattered. And mine carried weight. The acquisition stalled, renegotiated, improved, ultimately approved under far stronger terms. The firm survived. Not because of him, not because of me alone, but because governance was no longer optional. After the final vote, Daniel asked to speak privately. We stood in the empty conference room, no witnesses, no audience. I was wrong about you, he said quietly. Yes, I replied. He almost smiled at the simplicity of it. I thought you were comfortable staying in the background. I was never comfortable, I said. I was loyal. He nodded. And now? Now I am precise. A pause. You don't hate me, he observed. No, I said. Hate implies emotional investment. He absorbed that, slowly. That night, I walked home alone. The city lights reflected in the river, steady and indifferent. I thought back to that breakfast table, to the word medium, to the way I had chewed and swallowed without reaction. He believed that moment was dominance. It was ignition. He did not destroy my life. He forced me to evaluate it. An evaluation, when done honestly, requires reconstruction. He thought he had everything. What he had was scaffolding held together by my silence. When I withdrew it, the structure showed its weaknesses. And when I rebuilt, I built without shrinking, without hiding, without asking permission. This was never about revenge, it was about recalibration. And I am no longer someone who can be recalibrated by insult. I am the one who sets the framework now. Control is addictive, not power. Control. Daniel never cared about building something stable. He cared about steering it. And when you take the wheel from someone who believes the road belongs to him, he doesn't rage first. He studies. That's what he did. For weeks after the acquisition closed under improved terms, he was careful, cooperative, publicly supportive of the governance structure I had engineered. But privately, he began repositioning. I recognized it immediately. The first sign was subtle, a proposal to streamline reporting layers. Harmless language. Except streamlined reporting removes friction, and friction is what prevents quiet misalignment. I rejected it, not aggressively, methodically. The existing reporting tiers protect asset integrity, I said during the board call. If we remove them, we reintroduce opacity. 2 board members nodded. Daniel did not argue. He logged the resistance. The second sign was more deliberate. He began cultivating newer investors, younger, ambitious, less patient with compliance formalities. He framed governance as growth-resistant. He framed me as conservative. I did not respond emotionally. I scheduled private conversations. Not defensive. Clarifying. You see, reputation compounds faster than persuasion. By the time Daniel tried reframing me, I had already positioned myself as the architect of stability. Stability funds ambition. Investors remember that. Then he made a tactical error. He pushed through a secondary consulting agreement with a subsidiary vendor, without full disclosure. The amount was modest. The structure was not. When the quarterly compliance report flagged the irregularity, the system did exactly what I designed it to do. Automatic review, board notification, temporary suspension of discretionary authority. Daniel sat across from me again in the same conference room where he once dismissed me as medium. This time he did not lean back confidently. He leaned forward, careful. You're making this bigger than it is, he said. No, I replied calmly. The framework is. He understood then. This was not personal enforcement. It was structural inevitability. He had signed the framework. He had agreed to the trigger conditions. The system was not reacting to him. It was operating. And he was inside it. The investigation revealed nothing criminal, but it revealed intention, circumvention, soft boundary testing. The board did not appreciate that. A vote was called. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Measured. Daniel was removed as acting CEO, reassigned to advisory capacity pending review. He did not look at me during the vote, not once. Afterward, he requested a conversation. I agreed. We stood again, alone. You built something I can't maneuver around, he said quietly. Yes, I answered. You knew I would try. Yes? He gave a small, humorless laugh. You never raised your voice. I never needed to. A long pause. You planned further than I did. I observed longer than you did. He absorbed that, slowly. The industry response was swift. Commentary framed it as modern governance evolution. No one mentioned our marriage, no one needed to. The narrative had shifted. He was no longer the founder defining the structure. He was a component subject to it. That night, I returned home, not to celebrate, not to gloat, but to sit in quiet. There is no satisfaction in dismantling someone. There is only clarity in refusing to let them dismantle you. He once said I was medium. What he meant was manageable. He thought I would remain navigable, adjustable, soft. Instead, I became systemic. You can argue with a person. You cannot argue with a framework that activates automatically. A month later, Daniel announced his resignation. Public statement, gracious tone. Time for new leadership. It was accurate, just not voluntary. I did not attend the farewell gathering. I did not need to. My presence was already embedded in the bylaws, the audit protocols, the equity structures. Legacy is not applause. It's architecture that outlives ego. Weeks later, a final message arrived. You didn't destroy everything I thought I had. I read it carefully. He was right. I hadn't destroyed it. I had reclassified it. The illusion of unilateral control, the assumption of permanent leverage, the belief that loyalty equals weakness. Those were the things that dissolved. He destroyed those himself. I simply stopped protecting them. The morning after his resignation, I received an invitation. A National Advisory Council on Corporate Ethics. They wanted someone who understood both the psychology of power and the mechanics of preventing its abuse. I accepted. Not because of him, because I now understand something I didn't 15 years ago. Support is not submission. Silence is not absence. And women who observe quietly are not medium. They are measuring. And when the measurement is complete, they move, deliberately and permanently. Power attracts vacuum. The moment Daniel stepped down, the firm entered a transitional quiet, the kind that feels stable on the surface but unstable underneath. Leadership gaps invite opportunists. I had seen that pattern before. I refused to watch it repeat. The board approached me formally. We need interim stability, one member said. Not a symbolic figure, not a personality. They didn't say his name. They didn't need to. What are you asking? I replied. Step in. Not as consultant, not as advisor, as interim CEO. The title hung between us. For 15 years, I had operated in shadows. Now the architecture had my name attached to it. I did not hesitate. Yes. The announcement triggered industry noise, speculation, commentary, predictable headlines. Some praised the transition as inevitable evolution. Others framed it as poetic reversal. I ignored both. Narratives are distractions. Structures are what matter. My first action as CEO was not expansion. It was stabilization. I conducted internal listening sessions, not theatrical town halls, but focused, small group audits of morale, process breakdowns, and risk tolerance. The feedback was consistent. Under Daniel, decisions were reactive. Under the new governance model, people felt safer, but uncertain. Safety without direction becomes stagnation. So I provided direction. Clear quarterly objectives, transparent revenue targets, defined accountability lanes. No improvisational leadership theatrics, no emotional volatility, just measured movement. The first real test came within 60 days. A legacy client, one Daniel had cultivated personally, threatened to withdraw. They were loyal to him, a senior partner warned. No, I corrected. They were loyal to performance. I scheduled the meeting myself. No intermediaries. No negotiation performance. In the conference room, the client's CEO leaned back. Convince me this firm hasn't lost its edge. I met his gaze steadily. Under the previous structure, you were exposed to undisclosed risk, I said. Under mine, you're protected from it. Silence. Then I laid out compliance metrics, risk mitigation analytics, long-term performance modeling, no defensiveness, no apology. Data. He nodded once. You're different from him. Yes, I said calmly. That's the point. The contract renewed, expanded. Meanwhile, Daniel watched from advisory distance, not interfering, not publicly resentful, just present. It's difficult to observe the evolution of something you once believed required you, especially when it continues, stronger, without you. 3 months into my tenure, profits exceeded projections. Not dramatically, sustainably. The board requested I remove the interim from my title. Permanent CEO, I accepted without ceremony. No champagne, no speech, just documentation. I signed the contract with the same hand that once signed documents Daniel barely read. Full circle. Except this time, I was not accommodating someone else's ambition. I was directing my own. One evening, as I was leaving the office, Daniel approached. He no longer wore tailored dominance. He wore reflection. I used to think leadership was charisma, he said quietly. It's structure, I replied. He nodded slowly. I built something loud. Yes. And you rebuilt it quiet. Yes. Another pause. I don't recognize it anymore. That's because it no longer depends on you. No cruelty in my tone, just truth. He exhaled, almost relieved. I suppose that's what you meant by removing support. I removed distortion, I said. The next morning, I initiated the final step of my long-term plan. Equity redistribution. Not dilution, redistribution. Senior partners who demonstrated consistent ethical compliance received incremental equity increases. You want loyalty? You reward integrity. The firm transformed from personality-driven to principle-driven. And principles scale. Egos don't. 6 months later, at an industry summit, I delivered a keynote. Not about divorce, not about revenge, about systemic resilience. I stood at the podium and said, organizations fail when they mistake charisma for competence, control for leadership, and silence for weakness. The room was still. I didn't need to reference Daniel. The message carried. That night, alone in my office, I allowed myself one private reflection. Breakfast, coffee, toast, medium. That word had been the match. But the fire was always mine. Daniel thought he was discarding something average. He never realized he was standing on something foundational. And when you insult the foundation, it doesn't crack. It recalculates load distribution. And then it stands taller, without you. There is a moment after you win when the room goes quiet. Not because anyone doubts you, because they are recalibrating. That moment arrived the year we closed our largest acquisition, a national expansion. 3 regional firms folded into ours under governance structures I had designed. Compliance unified, reporting transparent, leadership decentralized. The press called it bold. It wasn't bold, it was inevitable. Growth reveals character, not just of individuals, of systems. And our system was clean. But Daniel had not disappeared. He had stepped back publicly. Privately, he had been building something new, smaller, lean, unregulated. I learned this not through gossip, but through a client inquiry. He approached us, the client said carefully. Different model, faster execution, less oversight. Less oversight. I didn't react. What did you tell him? I asked. We told him we don't gamble with structure anymore. Good. But Daniel wasn't courting stability. He was courting impatience. And impatience always finds a market. 3 months later, his new venture launched. Aggressive branding. Promises of freedom from bureaucratic drag. A quiet swipe at governance-heavy firms like mine. I did not respond publicly. I responded operationally. We tightened onboarding protocols, enhanced compliance automation, accelerated client reporting dashboards. You don't argue with disruption. You outbuild it. Then the call came. One of Daniel's early backers requested a confidential meeting. He's moving too fast, the investor admitted. No internal controls, no external audit triggers. I listened. I assume you're not here to praise him, I said evenly. He gave a tight smile. I'm here because you understand the architecture of risk. Yes, I did. Intimately. Within 6 months, Daniel's venture faced scrutiny. Not scandal. Scrutiny. Missed disclosures. Overstated projections. A liquidity crunch masked as strategic reinvestment. Patterns don't disappear when ego remains intact. They just re-emerge in new containers. The difference now? I was no longer inside the container. The industry press framed it delicately. Rapid growth challenges. I recognize the symptoms. When you build fast without reinforcement, stress fractures don't announce themselves. They split silently. Then suddenly, Daniel requested a meeting. Not defensive, not arrogant, measured. We met in a neutral office. He looked tired, not defeated, just aware. "You've seen the headlines," he said. "Yes." "I underestimated scale risk." "Yes." A faint smile touched his mouth. "You're consistent." "I am." He leaned back. "I don't want it to collapse." "That depends on whether you're willing to rebuild it." He studied me. "You'd help?" I considered that carefully, not emotionally, strategically. "Not as your safety net," I said, "as your structural consultant." "Terms matter." He nodded slowly. "And if I refuse?" "Then you repeat the pattern." Silence. He understood. 2 weeks later, I was contracted. Not privately, officially, board approved, full authority to implement governance corrections. The irony was almost elegant. He once called me medium. Now his survival depended on the systems I engineered. The audit revealed what I expected: inflated forecasts, loose expenditure tracking, overconcentration of decision authority. Nothing malicious, just reckless confidence. I did not scold, I did not gloat. I dismantled vulnerabilities, installed compliance triggers, separated personal branding from operational control, restructured equity voting thresholds. Daniel signed everything without protest. Experience teaches humility faster than humiliation ever could. Months passed. The venture stabilized. Smaller than projected, stronger than before. He invited me to observe a leadership meeting, not to speak, to witness. He opened the session with something unexpected. "We build nothing without oversight," he said to his team. "And we mistake confidence for competence at our own expense." He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. Afterward, he approached. "You didn't destroy everything I thought I had," he said quietly. "I told you," I replied. "I removed distortion." He nodded. "I thought you were leaving to prove something." "I left because I already knew something." "And that was?" "That I was never medium." He gave a short, almost relieved laugh. "No," he said softly. "You weren't." That night, alone, I reflected on something unexpected. Destruction is easy. Sustainable recalibration is harder. I could have let him collapse. Instead, I let him learn. Not for him, for the ecosystem. Weak structures don't just harm their founders, they destabilize everyone attached. 15 years of silence taught me observation. One breakfast insult triggered action. But what followed wasn't revenge, it was design. Daniel once believed he held everything. He thought power meant control. He thought control meant permanence. He was wrong. Power is architecture. Control is temporary. And permanence belongs to systems that don't depend on ego. I didn't burn his world down. I rewrote the blueprint. And this time, he reads the fine print. Redemption is fragile. Reputation is measurable. Trust, once recalibrated, does not return to its original form. It evolves into something sharper. Daniel's rebuilt venture stabilized under the framework I installed. Investors regained cautious confidence. Oversight became embedded rather than decorative. But something else shifted. He stopped chasing velocity. He started measuring sustainability. That alone told me the lesson had taken root. Meanwhile, my own firm entered its next phase: international expansion. Not flashy acquisition, controlled partnerships. We established governance consulting arms in London, Singapore, and Toronto. Each launch followed the same blueprint: local autonomy, centralized compliance standards, transparent equity splits. You cannot scale chaos, you scale clarity. Then came the invitation: a global economic forum. Panel discussion: power, ethics, and structural accountability in modern enterprise. They wanted both of us, Daniel and me, on the same stage. The organizers called it a compelling professional narrative. I called it inevitable. I accepted. The auditorium held 500 executives, bright lights, neutral backdrop. No personal references in the introduction, just credentials. He spoke first, measured, composed. I once believed speed and charisma were enough, when he said, "They're not." Then he gestured toward me. I learned that the hard way. No bitterness, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. When my turn came, I didn't narrate history. I delivered principle. Organizations collapse when internal control depends on personality. I said, they endure when accountability is structural, not optional. The audience leaned in. This wasn't about divorce. It was about design. During Q&A, a young entrepreneur stood up. How do you know when to leave a system versus fix it? She asked. The room went still. I answered carefully. You leave when the system requires you to shrink in order to survive inside it, I said. You fix it when you have the authority to redesign it without self-erasure. Silence. Then applause. Daniel didn't look surprised. He looked reflective. After the panel, we stood backstage. You could have destroyed me, he said quietly. I didn't want destruction, I replied. I wanted correction. He nodded. You were always stronger than I realized. No, I said evenly. I was always as strong as I was. You just benefited from my restraint. That landed. Softly. Months passed. Our firms no longer competed. They collaborated. Boundaries defined. Roles clear. He no longer attempted circumvention. And I no longer felt compelled to monitor him. That is the final stage of power. Indifference. One evening, alone in my apartment overlooking the river, I allowed myself a rare indulgence. Memory, breakfast table, coffee, toast. Medium. If he had insulted me with anger, I might have reacted. If he had cheated quietly, I might have tolerated longer. But boredom, dismissal, that was the fracture point. He didn't just underestimate me. He revealed how long I had been underestimating myself. There's something important about exit strategies. They aren't about revenge, they're about reclassification. When someone mislabels you, you have two choices: argue or outgrow the category. I chose the latter. A year after that breakfast, I received a handwritten note. Not from Daniel, from one of our junior partners. You changed how this industry sees leadership. That mattered more than any apology ever could. Daniel once believed he had built everything. He thought his empire stood on intellect and drive. He never saw the quiet reinforcement, the unseen architecture, the discipline. When I withdrew that reinforcement, he thought I was destroying him. I wasn't. I was removing distortion. Now he builds differently. Now I build visibly. And neither of us mistakes silence for weakness anymore. But make no mistake. If someone ever looks across the table and tries to reduce me again, I won't plan quietly. I won't need to. Because I no longer exist in spaces where my value requires explanation. I design the rooms now, and nothing inside them stands without integrity. Victory changes how people look at you, not just adversaries, everyone. The year after the forum, invitations multiplied. Boards, advisory councils, government task forces, structural accountability expert, governance architect, turnaround strategist. Titles accumulate quickly when the story behind them is clean. But here's what no one tells you. Power, once visible, attracts resistance. Not from enemies, from comfort. Inside my own firm, subtle friction began to surface. Not ethical violations, not misconduct, complacency. High performance had become expected, and expectation, if left unmanaged, becomes entitlement. I noticed it first in meetings. Junior partners interrupting analysts. Timelines slipping under the assumption that we'll fix it. The same early-stage arrogance Daniel once mistook for confidence. I did not confront it publicly. I measured it. 3/4 of internal performance metrics. 2 client satisfaction dips. 1 near miss in compliance escalation. Patterns form before collapse. You just have to look. At the annual executive retreat, I addressed it directly. No anger, no lecture, just clarity. Success is not self sustaining, I said to the leadership team. Structures decay when vigilance relaxes. A few uncomfortable shifts. Good. If you believe this firm is stable because of momentum, I continued, you misunderstand architecture. Silence. Then I did something unexpected. I reduced my own voting power. 10% of my executive authority redistributed to a compliance oversight committee. Gasps. One partner protested. You're weakening your control. No, I replied. I'm preventing dependency. You cannot preach distributed accountability while hoarding centralized power. Daniel learned that the hard way. I would not repeat it. The decision sent a message. Leadership here is not dominance, it is durability. Over the next year, internal culture sharpened. Audits became collaborative rather than punitive. Young associates spoke up earlier. Performance stabilized at a higher baseline. You cannot destroy ego externally and allow it internally. Consistency is integrity. Then came the unexpected call. Daniel's father had passed. Not dramatic. Natural causes. He left a modest estate and, surprisingly, a letter addressed to both of us. Daniel asked if I would join him at the reading. I considered declining. Then I reconsidered. Closure, if clean, does not destabilize. We sat in a quiet attorney's office. The letter was simple. His father wrote about regret, about watching patterns repeat across generations, about silence in marriages, about men mistaking provision for partnership. Then one line. If you are reading this together, I hope you both finally understand that control is not love and silence is not consent. Daniel exhaled slowly. I remained still. It wasn't revelation. It was confirmation. Patterns are inherited until someone interrupts them. I had interrupted them. Outside the office, Daniel looked at me. I used to think you stayed because you were comfortable, he said. I stayed because I believed loyalty could correct arrogance, I replied. And now? Now I know loyalty without boundaries is erosion. He nodded. We stood there for a long moment. Not former spouses, not rivals, just two people who had survived their own illusions. That night, alone, I walked through my apartment slowly. Glass walls, river lights, silence that felt earned. I thought about that breakfast again, not with anger, with precision. That was the fracture point. But fractures don't destroy strong material. They reveal where reinforcement was missing. I reinforced. He adjusted. And the world did not end. It recalibrated. There's a misconception about destroying everything someone thought they had. People imagine explosions, public humiliation, ruined reputations. But true destruction? It's quieter. It's forcing someone to confront the truth about what actually held their world together. Daniel thought he had built his empire alone. He thought he could replace support with novelty. He thought silence meant submission. What he lost wasn't wealth. It wasn't status. It was illusion. And illusion is fragile. I didn't burn down his life. I removed myself from its foundation. And once the dust settled, we both built better. But only one of us had to shrink first to understand why. Never again. Not for love, not for comfort, not for pride. If I sit across a table now and someone tries to measure me incorrectly, they won't get silence, they'll get clarity. And clarity is far more permanent than revenge. The second year after that breakfast, something unexpected happened. I stopped thinking about him. Not deliberately, not ceremonially, just naturally. There was no more internal replay of the insult. No more analytical dissection of his tone. No more structural comparison between who I was and who I had become. That chapter no longer required review. That's how you know something is finished. The firm was stable. International divisions were autonomous but aligned. Compliance was cultural, not imposed. I had stepped down from daily operational oversight and moved into strategic architecture, designing systems for organizations that wanted prevention rather than repair. And personally, I had redesigned my own governance. Boundaries that activate automatically. Access that requires reciprocity. No emotional joint accounts without mutual equity. One evening, during a private leadership roundtable, a young founder asked me a question that lingered. What was the real turning point? She asked. The audit, the affair, the divorce? I answered without hesitation. The insult. She blinked. Why that? Because it wasn't about betrayal, I said. It was about classification. He labeled me small. I realized I had allowed it. That's the part no one romanticizes. We participate in our own diminishment when we mistake endurance for strength. A month later, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly. Airport lounge. Neutral territory. He stood when he saw me. Reflex. Respect now. We exchanged measured greetings. How's the firm? He asked. Predictable, I replied. He smiled faintly. That used to sound boring. Predictable revenue is stability, I said. Stability is leverage. He nodded. I don't chase noise anymore. Good. A pause. Then he said something I hadn't anticipated. I tell people about you now. I tilted my head slightly. In what way? As the person who taught me that support isn't invisible, it's structural. I absorbed that. Not pride, not vindication, just acknowledgement. Good, I said again. Boarding was called. We walked in separate directions. No lingering, no emotional residue. That is what finality feels like. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I opened the folder labeled Completed. Inside were three things: the original operating agreement, the highlighted section 8.4, and the note he once wrote, "You weren't medium." I held it for a moment. Then I did something deliberate. I shredded it, not out of anger, out of irrelevance. I no longer needed proof of misjudgment. I no longer needed validation of strength. The evidence had already been built into my life. Here's what destroying everything he thought he had actually meant. It did not mean bankruptcy. It did not mean humiliation. It meant dismantling the illusion that he could define value unilaterally. It meant removing the infrastructure he assumed would remain loyal regardless of how he treated it. It meant replacing personality-driven power with principle-driven permanence. And most importantly, it meant refusing to shrink ever again. That breakfast table moment still exists in memory, but now it feels instructional, not painful. He said, "You're not even worth it anymore." He believed worth was assigned. He believed it was something a man measured and granted. He was wrong. Worth is not negotiated. It is enacted. And the moment you begin acting in alignment with it, everything recalibrates. Marriages, companies, rooms, power dynamics, even you. If someone sits across from you one day and tries to reduce you, don't argue. Don't perform outrage. Don't beg for recognition. Measure, document, architect, then move deliberately. Because the most devastating response to dismissal isn't destruction, it's elevation. And once you rise structurally, no one gets to call you medium again.